My son texted me while my husband and I were on vacation and said, "Don't bother coming back. I already sold the house. There's no place for you here anymore." I wish I were exaggerating. I wish that message had been some kind of cruel joke. But it wasn't. My name is Margaret Collins. I'm 72 years old, and for most of my life I believed the biggest achievement a woman could have was raising a good family. I spent decades cooking dinners, washing school uniforms, staying up late when my son had fevers, cheering at football games in the freezing rain, and telling myself that every sacrifice was worth it. Because someday, when I was old, my family would be there for me. At least, that's what I believed. But life has a way of revealing the truth when you least expect it. Before I continue, let me ask you something. If you enjoy real stories about life, family, betrayal, and second chances, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel. It helps more than you know, and it tells me that my story is reaching people out there who understand. Now, let me tell you how everything fell apart. 3 months ago, my husband Harold and I finally did something we had postponed for years. After 4 decades of working nonstop, we decided to take a small vacation. Nothing fancy, just a quiet road trip down the California coast. We packed our old silver Honda, threw 2 suitcases in the trunk, and drove south with the windows down and the ocean breeze coming through the car. For the first time in years, I felt light. Harold kept joking that we were acting like teenagers again. We stopped at roadside diners, shared milkshakes, and watched sunsets over the water. At night we stayed in modest motels, the kind with floral bedspreads and humming air conditioners. It wasn't luxury, but it was peaceful. And after a lifetime of responsibility, peace felt like a miracle. Meanwhile, back home in Phoenix, our son Daniel had offered to watch the house. He was 42 years old, recently divorced, and going through what he called a rough patch. Harold and I felt sorry for him. Maybe we shouldn't have. But parents don't stop being parents just because their children grow up. So we gave him the spare keys and told him he could stay there while we were gone. "Thanks, Mom," he said when we left. "Don't worry about anything. I've got everything under control." If I could go back to that moment, I would have looked him straight in the eye and asked a lot more questions. 3 days later, Harold and I were sitting outside a small seafood restaurant in Monterey when my phone buzzed. I remember the exact moment. The sun was setting. Seagulls were flying overhead. And Harold was laughing about something silly. Then I opened the message. It was from Daniel. At first I thought he was joking. The text read, "Don't bother coming back. I sold the house. It's not yours anymore." I stared at the screen for a full minute before my brain even processed the words. Then another message came through. "You're old. You can stay somewhere else." My hands started shaking so badly I almost dropped the phone. Harold looked at me and said, "Margaret, what's wrong?" I handed him the phone without saying a word. He read the message. Once. Then again. The color drained from his face. That doesn't make sense," he said quietly. But the worst part? Daniel wasn't joking. When we called him, he didn't deny it. He answered the phone casually, like we were asking about the weather. "Yeah," he said. "I sold it. The paperwork's done." Harold nearly shouted into the phone. "That's our house." Daniel sighed like we were being unreasonable. "Well, not anymore." I felt something inside my chest crack open. That house wasn't just a building. Harold and I had lived there for 38 years. We had painted every wall ourselves. Planted every tree in the backyard. Daniel had taken his first steps in that living room. And now our own son was telling us we couldn't come home. Where are we supposed to go? I asked. There was a pause on the line. Then Daniel said the words I will never forget. "That's not my problem." The call ended. Just like that. And suddenly, Harold and I were 2 elderly people sitting in a parking lot 700 miles from home, with nowhere to go. What happened next was even worse. Because for the next 3 nights, my husband and I slept in our car. And that was only the beginning. Because what my son didn't realize was that the woman he had just betrayed was about to teach him the most expensive lesson of his life. But that part of the story, that's where things get interesting. And I'll tell you exactly what happened next. The first night we slept in the car, I kept telling myself it was temporary. Just one night, I whispered to Harold as we reclined the seats of our old Honda in the parking lot of a quiet grocery store. The ocean air had disappeared hours earlier, replaced by the cold bite of midnight wind sneaking through the cracked windows. The leather seats felt stiff against my back, and every time I shifted, the car creaked like it was reminding us we didn't belong there. Harold tried to sound calm. "We'll figure something out in the morning," he said. But I could hear the strain in his voice. At 74 years old, my husband had spent his entire life providing for his family. He worked construction for 40 years, through heat waves, rainstorms, and winters that made his hands crack and bleed. That house our son sold, Harold built half of it himself. And now here we were, homeless, because of our own child. I stared at the dashboard clock glowing faint green in the darkness. 2:14 a.m. I hadn't slept a single minute. The first night we slept in the car, I kept telling myself it was temporary. Just one night, I whispered to Harold as we reclined the seats of our old Honda in the parking lot of a quiet grocery store. The ocean air had disappeared hours earlier, replaced by the cold bite of midnight wind sneaking through the cracked windows. The leather seats felt stiff against my back, and every time I shifted, the car creaked like it was reminding us we didn't belong there. Harold tried to sound calm. "We'll figure something out in the morning," he said. But I could hear the strain in his voice. At 74 years old, my husband had spent his entire life providing for his family. He worked construction for 40 years, through heat waves, rainstorms, and winters that made his hands crack and bleed. That house our son sold, Harold built half of it himself. And now here we were, homeless, because of our own child. I stared at the dashboard clock glowing faint green in the darkness. 2:14 a.m. I hadn't slept a single minute. Across the empty parking lot, a streetlight flickered softly, casting long shadows across the pavement. Somewhere in the distance, a truck engine rumbled. For the first time in my life, I understood what real helplessness felt like. You see, when you're young, you think being old means you've earned security. You think all the hard years add up to something stable. But that night, sitting in the passenger seat of a 12-year-old car with a thin blanket wrapped around my shoulders, I realized something terrifying. Age doesn't protect you, and neither does family. The next morning, Harold bought 2 coffees from a gas station with the last $20 in his wallet. We sat on a curb outside, holding the warm paper cups like they were tiny lifelines. "I'm calling Daniel again," Harold said finally. I didn't stop him. Part of me still hoped there had been some misunderstanding. Maybe the house hadn't really sold yet. Maybe Daniel would come to his senses. Maybe he'd realize what he'd done to us. Harold dialed the number. It rang 3 times. Then Daniel answered. "What?" he said flatly. Harold took a slow breath. "Son, your mother and I need to come home." Silence. Then Daniel laughed. Actually laughed. "You're still on that?" "Daniel," Harold said, trying to stay calm. "We have nowhere to go." "You should have thought about that before leaving the house empty," Daniel replied. My chest tightened. "That house was never empty," Harold snapped. "You were supposed to be watching it." "Well, I solved the problem," Daniel said casually. "Now I've got money." That sentence told me everything. This wasn't a mistake. This was planned. "You sold our home for money?" I whispered into the phone. Daniel didn't hesitate. "Relax, Mom. You're old. You don't need a big house anymore." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "What did you do with the money?" Harold asked. Daniel scoffed. "That's none of your business." Then he hung up. Just like that. We sat there on the curb for a long time without speaking. The world kept moving around us. Cars pulling into the gas station, people grabbing snacks, kids laughing in the back seat of minivans. Normal life. While ours had just collapsed. Finally Harold rubbed his face and said quietly, "Margaret, I think our son just stole our house." Hearing it out loud made the truth unavoidable. But the worst part wasn't the betrayal. It was the humiliation. At 72 years old, after raising a family and paying taxes and building a life, I was now a homeless grandmother sleeping in a parking lot. Night 2 was even harder. The temperature dropped to 48 degrees. Our backs ached. Harold's knees were stiff from being cramped inside the car. I wrapped my coat around him while he slept, pretending I wasn't cold myself. That night, I cried silently so he wouldn't hear. Not just because of Daniel, but because I had spent my entire life believing love and loyalty worked both ways. And now I knew the truth. Some people only love you while you're useful. By the third day, our situation was getting desperate. We had almost no money left. Hotels were too expensive. And every time I thought about calling friends or relatives, my stomach twisted with shame. How do you explain something like this? Hello, my son sold my house while I was on vacation. Can I sleep on your couch? No. I couldn't say those words. So instead, Harold and I sat in the car again that evening, watching the sunset through the windshield. Neither of us spoke for a long time. Then suddenly my phone rang. Unknown number. I almost ignored it. But something told me to answer. Hello. I said cautiously. A calm male voice responded. Hello, is this Margaret Collins? Yes. This is Thomas Reed. There was a pause. I believe I just bought your house. My heart stopped. For a moment, I couldn't breathe, because I had no idea that the man on the phone was about to change everything. And he was the first person who would help me take revenge on my own son. But that part of the story? Hello, is this Margaret Collins? The man's voice on the phone sounded calm, polite, almost careful. Yes, I answered slowly. This is Thomas Reed, he said. I believe I just bought your house. For a moment I couldn't speak. My fingers tightened around the phone so hard my knuckles turned white. Across the car, Harold looked at me with worried eyes. Who is it? He whispered. I put the phone on speaker. This is Margaret, I said. What do you mean you bought my house? The man on the other end took a breath. Your son Daniel sold a property in Phoenix 3 days ago. The address matches a house registered under your family name. My stomach twisted. Yes, I said quietly. That's our home. There was a short silence. Then Thomas Reed said something I did not expect. That's why I'm calling. Harold leaned closer to the phone. What do you mean? He asked. Well, the man replied. When I bought the property, Daniel told me the house belonged to him. He said his elderly parents had already moved to assisted living and wanted the place sold quickly. I felt heat rush to my face. That's a lie, I said immediately. Another pause. Mrs. Collins, Thomas said carefully. That's what I suspected. The air inside the car suddenly felt heavier. What do you mean suspected? Harold asked. I've been buying and renovating houses for 20 years, Thomas explained. Something about the sale felt rushed. Your son insisted on cash and pushed the paperwork through very quickly. My heart pounded. And when I visited the property yesterday, he continued, I noticed something strange. What? I asked. Your home doesn't look abandoned. I closed my eyes. Of course it didn't. The rose bushes in the front yard were still trimmed. The curtains were still drawn exactly the way I left them. The wind chimes Harold installed last spring were probably still hanging on the porch. That house isn't empty, Thomas continued quietly. It looks lived in. Harold clenched his fists. Because it was lived in, he said. For 38 years. The silence that followed was long. Then Thomas said something that made my heart beat faster. I had a feeling something wasn't right. So I looked into the property records. My breath caught. And, well, he said slowly, the house isn't legally registered in Daniel's name. Harold and I looked at each other. What? Harold asked. The property title, Thomas continued, still lists you and your husband as the legal owners. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Art, are you sure? I whispered. Yes, Thomas said. Which means your son may have sold something he didn't legally own. Harold suddenly sat up straighter. That means the sale is illegal, he said. Potentially, Thomas replied. That's why I'm calling you before I do anything else. My mind was racing. For 3 days I had believed everything was lost. Our home, our life, our security. But now, there was a crack in Daniel's plan. What do you want from us? I asked cautiously. Thomas chuckled softly. Honestly, I want the truth. The truth is simple, Harold said firmly. Our son betrayed us. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I told someone everything. I told Thomas about the vacation, the text message, the phone call, the 3 nights Harold and I had spent sleeping in the car. I didn't cry, but my voice shook. When I finished, the line stayed quiet for several seconds. Then Thomas spoke again. Well, he said slowly, your son didn't just betray you. He may have committed a serious crime. Harold exhaled sharply. What happens now? He asked. That depends, Thomas replied. On what? On whether you want your house back. I didn't even need to think. Yes, I said immediately. That house wasn't just property. It was where my son learned to walk, where birthdays were celebrated, where Harold and I spent almost 4 decades building a life. I wasn't ready to lose it because of Daniel's greed. Thomas continued. If the title is still in your name, I may be able to reverse the transaction. Hope flickered inside me for the first time in days. But, he added carefully, that process could expose your son to serious legal trouble. Harold didn't hesitate. He deserves it. But I stayed quiet. Because no matter what Daniel had done, he was still my child. Thomas must have sensed my hesitation. Mrs. Collins, he said gently, people like your son count on one thing. What? I asked, parents being too kind to fight back. His words landed deep inside my chest. For 3 days, Harold and I had suffered because of Daniel's choices. 3 nights in a car. 3 nights of humiliation. 3 nights wondering if our lives were over. And suddenly I realized something. If I didn't stand up now, Daniel would never learn. I took a deep breath. Mr. Reed, I said slowly. Yes. What would you do if someone treated your parents like this? There was a pause. Then he answered honestly. I'd make sure they never did it again. I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. Then let's do exactly that. But neither Harold nor I realized yet that the plan we were about to create would not only get our house back, it would leave Daniel drowning in millions of dollars of debt. And the moment he realized what we had done was something I will never forget. When I told Thomas Reed we wanted our house back, the line went quiet for a moment. Then he said something that surprised me. All right, he said calmly. But if we do this, we do it the smart way. Harold leaned forward in his seat. What does that mean? It means, Thomas replied, we don't just reverse the sale. There was a pause. We teach your son a lesson he'll never forget. Those words hung in the air inside our car. For 3 days Harold and I had felt powerless, old, forgotten. But suddenly, for the first time since Daniel sent that message, I felt something else. Control. Explain, Harold said. Thomas cleared his throat. Your son rushed the sale, he began. He pushed the paperwork through fast, took the money, and assumed no one would question it. That sounds like Daniel, I muttered. Well, Thomas continued, that speed works against him. How? I asked. Because legally speaking, he committed fraud. Harold's eyebrows lifted. You're saying he could go to jail? It's possible, Thomas said. Selling a property you don't own is a serious offense. I felt a strange mixture of emotions swirl inside me. Anger, sadness, and something else. Disappointment. You see, when your child is little, you imagine their future. You picture them growing into kind adults. Honest people. You never imagine sitting in a car at 72 years old while someone explains how your son might be a criminal. What do we need to do? Harold asked. Thomas's voice became more focused now. First, I need proof the house belongs to you. That's easy, Harold said. We have the deed. Good. Second, I'll need copies of any messages Daniel sent you. I looked down at my phone. The cruel text message was still there. Don't bother coming back. I sold the house. I swallowed hard. I'll send it to you, I said. Perfect, Thomas replied. And third, I need you to trust me. Harold frowned. Trust you with what? With the house, Thomas said. For a moment, neither of us spoke. What do you mean? I asked carefully. Well, Thomas explained. Technically the transaction with your son already went through. That's the problem, Harold said. Yes, but it can also become the solution. I leaned closer to the phone. Go on. If we cancel the sale immediately, Thomas said, your son will likely try to fight it. People like him panic when their money disappears. That sounds exactly like Daniel, Harold muttered. But if we handle this differently, Thomas continued, we can put him in a position where he has no way out. My curiosity grew. What kind of position? Thomas lowered his voice slightly, like he was explaining a chess move. The money your son received from me was transferred legally. Okay, Harold said slowly. Then things are about to get very interesting. I felt a chill run down my spine. What do you mean? It means, Thomas said, if the court forces him to repay the money and he doesn't have it, he'll be in debt, Harold finished. Massive debt, Thomas confirmed. For the first time since this nightmare started, Harold actually smiled. Serves him right. But I stayed quiet. Because despite everything, the thought of my own son drowning in financial ruin still hurt. Thomas must have sensed my hesitation again. Mrs. Collins, he said gently, I know this isn't easy. No, I admitted softly. But what your son did to you isn't easy either. I looked at Harold. 3 nights in a car. 3 nights watching my husband struggle to sleep with aching joints. 3 nights wondering how we would survive. And suddenly something inside me hardened. You're right, I said quietly. What's that? Thomas asked. If Daniel thought he could throw us away. I took a slow breath. He was very wrong. Thomas's tone sharpened with approval. Then we begin tomorrow. How? Harold asked. I'm flying to Phoenix in the morning, Thomas said. And when I get there, his voice carried a hint of something almost amused. I'm going to knock on your son's door. I could practically see Daniel's smug expression in my mind. He probably thought he had won. That Harold and I were gone for good. That he had outsmarted everyone. But he had no idea what was coming. Because the man who bought our house was about to become the reason our son lost everything. And when Daniel opened that door the next morning, the look on his face was something I wish I could frame and hang on my wall. But what happened next? That's where the real revenge started. The next morning, Harold and I were still sitting in our car outside a quiet diner when my phone rang. It was Thomas Reed. I'm here, he said. My stomach tightened immediately. Already? I asked. Phoenix isn't far when you catch the early flight, he replied calmly. Harold leaned closer. Are you at the house? He asked. There was a small pause on the line. Yes, Thomas said. For a moment I couldn't breathe. 38 years of memories were sitting behind that front door. And we weren't there. Is everything okay? I asked nervously. Well, Thomas said slowly. Your son seems very comfortable. Harold scoffed. Of course he does. Thomas continued. There's a brand new sports car in the driveway. That didn't surprise me. Daniel had always loved showing off. What about the house? I asked. Looks exactly like you described, Thomas said. Rose bushes in the yard, wind chimes on the porch, and the curtains still hanging in the windows. I closed my eyes for a moment. Just hearing those details made my chest ache. That's our home, I whispered. Not for long, Harold said quietly beside me. On the phone, Thomas exhaled. All right, he said. I'm going to knock. My heart began pounding. Even though I was hundreds of miles away, it felt like I was standing right there on that porch. We heard the faint sound of footsteps through the phone. Then the dull thud of knuckles against a door. Knock. 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 A few seconds passed. Then the door opened. We could hear Daniel's voice through the phone. What do you want? Same arrogant tone. Same impatience. Thomas spoke calmly. Good morning. My name is Thomas Reed. Silence. Then Daniel said, So, I believe we need to talk about the house you sold me. Another pause. Then Daniel laughed. Oh yeah, the house. His voice sounded smug. Transactions done, buddy. Not my problem anymore. I felt anger rising in my chest. Thomas stayed calm. Yes, he said politely. About that transaction. What about it? Daniel snapped. Well, Thomas continued. I visited the county records office this morning. Harold squeezed my hand. And according to the records, The house isn't legally yours. For a moment there was total silence on the phone. Then Daniel's voice came back. Sharp. What are you talking about? The title is still in Margaret and Harold Collins' names, Thomas said. Daniel laughed again. But this time it sounded forced. That's impossible. I assure you, Thomas replied, it's not. The air on the phone suddenly felt heavy. Look, Daniel said quickly, maybe the paperwork just hasn't updated yet. That's what I thought too, Thomas said calmly. Another pause. But the county clerk confirmed something interesting. Harold leaned forward. What? He whispered. Thomas continued. They confirmed you never had legal authority to sell the property. On the other end of the phone, Daniel's voice changed completely. What are you trying to say? I'm saying, Thomas replied, that the sale you conducted may be considered fraud. The word hung in the air like thunder. Fraud. Daniel's tone exploded. That's ridiculous. Is it? Thomas asked calmly. You paid me already, Daniel shouted. Yes, Thomas said. And now that money may need to be returned. Silence. Real silence this time. Then Daniel said something that made Harold shake his head. That's not my problem. Thomas chuckled softly. I'm afraid it is. You signed the deal, Daniel snapped. That's on you. Actually, Thomas replied. When someone sells property they don't own, the law tends to disagree. I could practically hear Daniel's confidence cracking. You can't prove anything, he muttered. Oh, Thomas said pleasantly. I believe your parents can. My breath caught, because for the first time in this entire nightmare, Daniel finally understood something. Harold and I weren't gone, and we weren't staying silent. Wait, Daniel said suddenly. You talked to them? Yes, Thomas answered. And they're very interested in getting their house back. The next thing Daniel said made my hands shake. Those old people should just stay wherever they are. Harold's face turned red, but Thomas stayed perfectly calm. Well, he said lightly, that may be difficult. Why? Because they're about to come home. There was a long pause. Then Daniel said quietly, you can't do this. Thomas's voice turned firm for the first time. Oh, I absolutely can. And then he said the words that started the downfall of my son. I've already contacted a lawyer. But what Daniel didn't realize yet was that the legal process about to begin would not only take our house back, it would bury him under millions of dollars in debt. And when he finally understood how badly he had miscalculated, he showed up at our door begging. But that moment? That's where the real story begins. 3 days after Thomas Reed knocked on my son's door, Harold and I finally returned home. Not quietly. Not secretly. We came back with a lawyer. Her name was Laura Bennett, and she had already reviewed every document Thomas sent her. According to her, the situation was worse than we thought. Much worse. You didn't just get tricked, Laura told us as we sat in her office. Your son committed multiple violations. Harold frowned. Violations. Laura slid a folder across the desk. Selling property you don't own is considered fraud in many cases, she said. And depending on how the money was transferred, it could involve civil penalties, criminal investigation, or both. I felt sick hearing those words. No matter what Daniel had done, he was still my son. But Harold's jaw tightened. He made his choices. Laura nodded. Right now we have 3 goals, she explained. Reclaim legal possession of your house. Reverse the fraudulent sale. Recover the money Daniel took. I blinked. Recover the money? Yes, she said. Thomas Reed has already agreed to cooperate fully. Harold leaned back in his chair. Smart man. Laura smiled slightly. He's very interested in getting his $3 million back. $3 million. Even saying the number out loud still sounded unreal. Laura continued. And if Daniel can't repay it? She paused. The court can seize his assets. Harold immediately asked the question we were both thinking. His cars? Yes. The house? Yes. Everything. Laura didn't hesitate. Everything. For a moment the room went quiet. Then she added one more thing. And based on what we've discovered, Daniel may already be in serious trouble. What do you mean? I asked. Laura opened another document. After receiving $3 million, he made several very large purchases. Harold groaned. Oh no. Laura listed them calmly. A sports car, a luxury condo, and several cryptocurrency transfers. That last part made Harold sigh. He gambled it. Laura nodded. Most likely. I rubbed my temples. This is a disaster. Yes, Laura said. But it's a disaster we can fix. And then she told us the next step. We're filing a civil fraud case tomorrow morning. 2 days later, Daniel showed up. Not at the lawyer's office. Not at court. At our house. Harold and I were standing in the kitchen when someone started pounding on the door. Not knocking. Pounding. Bang. 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 Harold looked through the window. Then he sighed. It's him. My stomach dropped. Daniel. He nodded. He looks different. Harold opened the door. And for the first time in years, my son looked nervous. His expensive jacket was wrinkled. His hair was messy. And his eyes looked tired. Mom, he said. Just hearing that word nearly broke my heart. But Harold stepped between us. What do you want? Daniel swallowed. We need to talk. Harold folded his arms. We tried that 38 years ago. Daniel ignored the comment and looked at me. Mom, I'm in serious trouble. Harold laughed bitterly. Yes, you are. Daniel's voice shook. That guy you sent to my house, that investor. You mean the man you scammed? Harold asked. Daniel winced. He's suing me. Yes, Harold said calmly. So are we. Daniel looked stunned. You're suing me too? Harold didn't hesitate. You stole our home. Daniel ran his hands through his hair. I didn't think it would turn into this. Harold shook his head. That's because you never think past tomorrow. Daniel looked at me again. Mom, please. His voice cracked. If you drop the case, I'll fix everything. Harold scoffed. How? Daniel hesitated. Then he admitted something shocking. I already spent most of the money. Harold stared at him in disbelief. $3 million? Daniel nodded slowly. Crypto crashed, the condo deposit, the car. Harold stepped back and laughed in pure disbelief. You're broke. Daniel didn't answer. Which meant yes. Then he said the words I never thought I'd hear from my son. Mom, I need your help. The silence that followed felt endless. Because after everything he had done, after stealing our home, after trying to sell it out from under us, my son was standing on our porch asking for mercy. And what I said next changed his life forever. But that moment, that decision, that's where everything truly exploded. Daniel stood on our porch like a stranger. Not the confident man who sold our house. Not the smug voice we heard on the phone. Just a tired, desperate man who had finally run out of luck. Mom, please, he said again. His voice was smaller now. Harold crossed his arms. You've got a lot of nerve showing up here. Daniel looked down at the porch boards. I didn't know where else to go. Harold gave a dry laugh. You could try the condo you bought with stolen money. Daniel didn't answer. That silence said everything. The condo was gone. Probably repossessed already. I finally spoke. How much do you have left? Daniel hesitated. Then he muttered. Almost nothing. Harold stared at him like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. $3 million, he said slowly. And you burned through it in a few weeks? Daniel rubbed his face. I thought the crypto investment would double. Harold shook his head. Of course you did. Daniel looked at me again. Mom, if you and Dad drop the case, I'll work it off. Harold burst out laughing. Work it off? You think we're hiring you? Daniel's eyes filled with frustration. I'm trying to fix this. Harold's voice turned sharp. No. You're trying to save yourself. That hit hard. Even Daniel didn't argue. Then he said something that made the air go completely still. If the lawsuit goes through, I could go to jail. The word hung there. Jail. No parent ever wants to hear that about their child. Even after everything. I felt my chest tighten. Daniel noticed. Mom, he said quietly, please. Harold looked at me. He didn't say anything. But I knew what he was thinking. Daniel made his choices. Actions have consequences. Still, he was my son. 38 years earlier, I had held him as a baby. I had taught him to walk. I had read him stories at night. And now he was standing in front of me asking for mercy. I took a deep breath. "Daniel," I said softly. He looked up instantly, hope flashing across his face. "I will not drop the case." The hope vanished. "But," I continued, "I'm not doing this to destroy you." Daniel looked confused. "Then why?" "Because you need to face what you did." Harold nodded slowly beside me. "For once in your life." Daniel shook his head. "You don't understand. If I lose everything." "You already lost everything," Harold interrupted. "You just didn't notice yet." Daniel looked desperate. "What am I supposed to do?" I answered honestly. "Tell the truth." "To who?" "The court. The lawyer. The investor." Daniel stared at me like I'd just suggested something impossible. "That will ruin me." I held his gaze. "You ruined yourself." The porch was silent. Wind chimes on the porch swayed gently in the breeze. Finally Daniel whispered, "So you're really doing this?" "Yes." He looked between Harold and me. Then he laughed softly. But there was no humor in it. "I guess I finally pushed too far." Harold shrugged. "About 20 years too far." Daniel stepped back from the door. For a moment he looked like he might say something else. Instead he just nodded. "All right." He turned and walked toward the street. Halfway down the driveway he stopped. Without turning around he said one last thing. "You know, if you had just given me the house, none of this would have happened." Harold couldn't help it. He laughed. "Still blaming us." Daniel didn't reply. He just kept walking. And that was the last time we saw him as a free man. Because 3 weeks later, the court case began. And when the judge reviewed what Daniel had done, the courtroom went silent. But the real shock came when the judge announced the final ruling. And it was something even Harold and I didn't expect. That moment is where the story ends. 3 weeks later, Harold and I sat quietly inside the courtroom. I never imagined I'd one day be in court. Because of my own son. Our lawyer, Laura Bennett, sat beside us with a thick stack of documents. Across the room sat Daniel. He looked very different from the man who had shown up at our porch. No expensive jacket. No confidence. Just a tired man in a plain suit, staring at the floor. Next to him was his attorney. And a few seats away sat the investor who had started the whole process, Thomas Reed. Thomas nodded politely when he saw us. Harold leaned over and whispered, "Smart man." Laura quietly explained what would happen. "The judge will review the title records, the sales agreement, and the payment transfer," she said. And then we'll find out how much trouble Daniel is really in." The courtroom doors opened. Everyone stood as the judge walked in. The hearing began. The first 20 minutes were all documents. Title records. Property ownership history. Transfer records from the county office. Then the judge said something that made the entire room go quiet. According to the county registry, the property located at the Collins residence has never been transferred from the original owners. Which meant exactly what we already knew. Daniel had sold a house he didn't legally own. The judge looked directly at him. "Mr. Collins, did you represent yourself as the legal owner of this property during the sale?" Daniel's lawyer whispered something to him. Then Daniel nodded. "Yes." The judge leaned back slightly. "And did you receive payment for this transaction?" Another pause. "Yes." "How much?" Daniel swallowed. $3 million. A few people in the courtroom shifted in their seats. The judge looked through the documents again. Then came the words that changed everything. "This court finds that the property sale conducted by Mr. Daniel Collins is legally invalid." Harold squeezed my hand. "The property remains under the legal ownership of Margaret and Harold Collins." For the first time in months, I could breathe again. Our house was safe. But the judge wasn't finished. "Furthermore," he continued, "Mr. Collins knowingly misrepresented his authority to sell the property." He looked toward Thomas Reed. "As a result, Mr. Reed suffered financial damages." Thomas remained calm. Then the judge delivered the ruling. "Mr. Collins is ordered to repay the full $3 million to Mr. Reed." Daniel's head dropped. But the next part hit even harder. If payment cannot be made immediately, the court authorizes asset seizure and wage garnishment until the debt is satisfied. Harold quietly whispered, "He's finished." But the judge had one final statement. And it surprised everyone, including us. Given the clear evidence of intentional misrepresentation, the judge said, "This case will also be referred to the district attorney for review of potential criminal fraud charges." The room fell silent. Even Daniel's lawyer looked uneasy, because that meant one thing. This wasn't just a financial disaster anymore. It could become a criminal case. The judge struck the gavel. Court adjourned. Just like that. It was over. Outside the courthouse, Thomas Reed walked over to us. "I'm glad you got your home back," he said. Harold shook his hand. "Thank you for helping us expose the truth." Thomas shrugged lightly. "I just wanted my money back." "Fair enough." Then he added something unexpected. "Your son made a terrible mistake." I nodded quietly. "Yes." Thomas looked at the courthouse doors. "But sometimes hitting the bottom is the only way someone learns." Maybe he was right. Maybe he wasn't. I don't know what Daniel's future will look like now. The courts will decide that. But I do know one thing. Harold and I went home that afternoon. Back to the little house with the rose bushes and wind chimes. The house we built together. The house our son tried to take from us. And the house that reminded us of something important. Family can hurt you. Money can tempt people. But the truth? The truth always finds its way to the surface eventually. And when it does, justice usually follows.